For regular listeners getting confused by this new voice, let me introduce myself. I'm Liam, the editor of the podcast. Thank you to all our patrons, especially the big players who keep this whole thing going. Ashley, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, and Sarah Turner. Thank you very much. And also, I think it's probably nice to give a shout out once a week to at least one random patron, Bruce Rogers Vaughan. Thank you also. We're on all the big social media platforms. Reddit and TikTok are the biggest following. So maybe if you can't contribute money, by all means, join us on social media and spread the word.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, humanoids of the internet. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head, podcast about capitalism and mental health, and insert more words that elaborates on what that means. I'm Max, co-host. Harriet is not here today. She is elsewhere, I believe, traveling or taking care of some important business. So it's just me as the co-host today. But we also have Liam, which is cool because I think, Liam, this may be the first time we're always giving Liam a shout out as sort of our editor and social media person. But even more importantly, or okay, maybe not more importantly, Liam, not more importantly, awesomely, excitedly, we have someone named Dr. Jeffrey Ansloos with us today, who was actually recommended to us, by the way, by one of our patrons who actually may be a student of yours, Dr. Ansloos. I'm not quite sure, but he spoke really highly of you. We have this little sort of a patron like chat room thing where people will say, "Oh, you should get this person on and that person on," and so that's actually how we found out about you. And then we started reading into your work, and Liam read one of your books. So anyway, so Dr. Ansloos is a professor at the University of Toronto, Canada Research Chair of Critical Studies in Indigenous Health and Social Action on Suicide, and is a counseling and clinical psychologist. I didn't actually went a little bit against what you typed in there, but anyway, so there's Dr. Ansloos. But so yeah, it's an honor because your work is I think relatively, if not strongly, aligned with our general way of thinking about mental health as mental health professionals ourselves, who are kind of critical of the kind of the mainstream zeitgeist and how we talk about and practice quote unquote mental health work. So yeah, before getting into the meat and potatoes or whatever of questions, do you want to also just say anything about yourself to kind of say who you are and what you do
Sure.
and whatnot?
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, thanks so much for having me to join in conversation with you both today. This is an exciting podcast. I know that. I think what got me to a yes at the invitation was immediately feeling at home with sort of a critical anti-capitalist and anti-colonial approach to thinking about mental health, and broadening conversations around the social and economic and political dimensions that impact our communities and our day-to-day lives is something that is very core to my work. So yeah, I'm really just happy to be with you both in conversation today, and I'm looking forward to learning with you.
Yay. Well, welcome to the family. Yeah. I mean, I feel like there's actually not a whole lot of us. Although I found since we started the podcast, we're finding there are a lot more than we thought, that when you kind of when you create or get thrown into structures and networks and stuff, you find oh, there's a lot of other people that think that this weird, the diagnostic system is weird and the, all of that stuff. So, so yeah, it's a huge honor to have you. Well, yeah. So the first question I had for you is it's kind of jumping into kind of a heavy thing, having to do with kind of indigeneity, colonialism, and suicide, which aren't ultralight topics. But maybe because as a background, it seems from what we just doing a little bit of homework on you is that's one of maybe not the main thing you study or something, but it's definitely a big part of what you study and work on. So I guess so just out of curiosity, either from a research perspective or just kind of spitballing on this, how do you think the history of genocide and colonialism has impacted suicide rates and other related things, depression, anxiety, PTSD, however we want to frame these things within Indigenous communities throughout North America, and maybe even beyond North America, right? In other settler colonies, or other, where there's colonized peoples and whatnot. Just any kind of answer you have to that question, go for it.
Sure. Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, my particular area of commitments in terms of research and practice is in supporting Indigenous communities to live vibrant lives. And the truth of the matter is that so many of the sort of health and social inequities that you just highlighted, related to suicide or related to mental health outcomes, or related to other forms of sort of social, political, and economic inequities, are best understood from my perspective within a broader structural and systemic view, and one that isn't just sort of ahistorical, but embedded within, as you alluded to, the history of colonialism on Turtle Island and throughout, what we colonially call North America and the countries therein. And I think, the relationship of those things is not simple, and it's not monolithic. It looks very different from community to community. But I certainly have the perspective and do work which considers both the historical impacts of colonial policies. So things like what the formation of, essentially, in Canada and the United States, functioned like an apartheid economic system and social class system for Indigenous people. In what ways that produced very particular forms of social and health inequalities on purpose. Those weren't just like incidental to these policies, but they were at their core design intended to produce erasure of Indigenous peoples quite materially, like quite lethally from the land, for the purpose of settling. But it doesn't end just in first contact or the formation of the colonial nation states. That it continues intimately into the lives of Indigenous people today. In Canada, up until quite recently, within the last year, the federal government was sued again on this basis. But Indigenous children receive about 70 cents to the dollar in public health expenditures. That's literally built into our national budgeting, a racialized form of health inequality. And that's just one example of many. But yeah, I mean, colonial structures and systems of governments and the values that colonization in this continent enshrined, and around the world, but in particular in settler colonial contexts like the United States and Canada and Australia, New Zealand and South Africa and elsewhere, there's the profound impact on what makes life livable, what makes life possible. Indigenous communities in these places were and continue to be set up to fail, set up to not be allowed to have every other opportunity that others have, and yet are at the same time policed and surveilled in every way, including the freedom to die, the freedom to not live in a world that's treating you poorly. And I think the mental health professions that we work in very complexly intersect with that. So yeah, I'm going to just take a pause there. And wow. I don't know if I've answered the question, but I'm sure there's lots to respond to and unpack.
Yeah, I mean, I have like probably between 2 and 5 things I want to ask you from that. I'm also wondering, Liam, since I know Liam, you've read more by Dr. Ansloos than I have. So if you have anything,
I've got a lot, but I sort of prefer to hear the professionals sort of go back and forth.
Whatever, man. All right, fine. So yeah. Well, I mean, feel free. Well, okay. I mean, there's so many things. I guess one, if I can track the questions that were popping up for me, like one is like the 70 cents on the dollar, because this is maybe a complex question, but like, would things be better if that 70 were moved to 100? If that almost budgetary allocation were equalized? And I guess the reason I ask that is like, because you mentioned some other because let's say, if that happened, obviously I think anyone that, I don't know, has like a heart and a brain would say like, yeah, that'd be a change. That's a good change. But I would think that when you're saying something like not being allowed to die, like there's the more surveillance, state capital structures that would still be in place, presumably, but then there's still the history and almost maybe from an existential point of view or something. And maybe this is ignorant of me. Maybe hopefully there's no like weird, I don't know, noble savage stupidity in my mind around this, but that I would think that there's not just from a sort of lack of material resourcing and whatnot, but that there is like, speaking as someone who has not experienced this, but just as like understanding it, that when you have like your entire sort of history, culture, language, religion, everything sort of either erased or that you have to like fight tooth and nail to even try to keep parts of it, I would just think that in and of itself creates something that is a mental health struggle that kind of it can't be put into the bounds of that more diagnostic or mainstream framework, if that makes sense, because it is more of like, it's like a cultural, historical, like political, et cetera, issue, right? That like can't be like, oh, let's do an intervention to treat the symptoms. So anyway, here's my like convoluted comment for you.
I want to respond to that last piece more so than the first part, but I'll try both. I sort of read about this in my work, particularly my more recent work, as the social logics of suicide or the social logics of Indigenous people's suicides, which is to say, by and large, the sort of dominant psychologically focused research in suicide and suicide prevention particularly makes a lot of assumptions about people that are suicidal. Our first assumption is that they're depressed. Our second assumption is that depression is something that's sort of maybe socially interactive, but largely bioorganic and kind of emerges inside of a person's body or their mind, and that it is always an irrational thing to die or to want to die. And I guess what I sort of talk about is the social logics of, or the colonial logics of suicide, and borrowing from Michael Krall, who first sort of coined that phrase, the social logics of suicide. When I think about it in the context of colonization, I guess I think that when you have a very complex history of statecraft, which was pointed towards the eradication of an entire group of people, and that's not hyperbole. That's literally, evidenced within within American, Canadian, and the colonial powers that founded Mexico, Canada, and the United States, pre-independence. These were embedded within their policies, quite literally, with the goal of eradicating people. And then add to that a kind of 500-year, depending on where you're talking about, history of sort of sequential efforts to eradicate, then to assimilate, to control, to deny language, to deny mobility, deny all sorts of basic human rights. In that world, and in a world where in the present day of many Indigenous communities' experience of racialized policing, of violent victimization, of multiple forms of sort of racialized social policy, not to mention just day-to-day material realities of experiencing forms of poverty or experiencing forms of social disadvantage and structured violence. I think, is it a logical thing to feel depressed in the face of that? Yeah, I do. Do I think when a world tells you that your life is disposable, that the capital accumulation kind of surrounding your life is more valuable than your life itself? I think that it's logical. At the very least, we can say it's logical, or I can at least empathize with the desire to die. And that's not me making a comment about whether or not we should prevent death, but that's just simply saying, like, yeah, depression is an inadequate word to describe and the sort of mainstream ways which we conceptualize mental illness as something where a person has sort of a pathologized state of thinking or a kind of defunct internal structure that's not working right. I don't think captures the complexity of the distress that not only Indigenous people face, but lots of different groups of people face in the wake or in the face of social forms of violence. So I definitely would say I have a more structural argument about health. And I think to your first question, I would just say that, I'm sort of, I think your question actually is about like what I believe effective change looks like. And I think, there are reforms, in Canada, I'd love to see the equalization of those health payments, or I'd love to see our government not sue young people that challenge the government for, failing to guarantee their basic rights. But I also think that I don't put a lot of like long-term big faith in sort of governmentality as a means of championing like justice. I think I look to more immediate organizing of communities. I look to more emergent and relational forms of care and mutual aid. And I think, there are things we can do, but I also think that the state as a structure is not actually interested in the type of justice that our people need. It actually contravenes the interests of the state to be concerned about Indigenous people self-determinism or the welfare of the planet, or you kind of name it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in the States here, I wonder, Liam, with what the UK people think about Canada, but in the States, we're often, people will say, well, at least Canada has like, some of the, it's the softer capitalism and stuff, right? Like compared to us. So sometimes we'll say like, look at their healthcare, or look at this or that or whatever. But yeah, I mean, if the state is still sort of designed to serve capital and all the other things, then yeah, there's always endless room for criticism of kind of the function of the state in a sort of settler-colonial, let's just move money for the sake of money around for like 10 people around the world or whatever. Well, so based on all that too, I mean, I actually just thought of a guest we had on months ago named Jennifer White, who she's also in Canada somewhere. I don't know. I wonder if she's like, I'm so ignorant about Canada. This is like such an American thing. I'm just like somewhere in Canada, where
we're dear friends. We're dear friends.
Not. Yeah. Wait, are you? You and Jennifer White?
Yes. We're what is the thickest thieves. We're really good friends.
Oh, is she at University of Toronto?
No, she's at the University of Victoria, but we used to work together. We used to work
together. Yeah, okay, because some of the things you were saying, something that stood out for me, because I was trained clinically in DBT, which has that like, let's help someone build a life worth living. And I always really respected, and you could, I have criticisms of DBT for sure, but Marsha Linehan talking about, like, it's not really about suicide prevention. Like, that's kind of like a weird concept, but that like, helping someone build a life worth living. But then Jennifer White, like, it totally blew my mind. She's like, well, why don't we talk about building worlds worth living in? Because for some people, it just doesn't even seem like this world is worth living in. And that's where some of the despair and everything comes in, right? Where it's just like, if I've had everything taken from me, I'm listening to the stories of my grandparents, my elders. I'm looking at the ravaging of, the climate and whatever, choose a thing to pay attention to for 5 minutes. It's like, why would I even want to continue living here? So I totally, I vibe with that. And also, I mean, I've even found, like, not to derail too much to this, but like clinically, I mean, cause I've experienced bouts of like suicidal, like all kinds of stuff, especially when I was younger. And I think like having experienced that, understanding that it's really beyond symptoms, and it's almost like maybe a psycho-spiritual experience. And it's definitely like a sociological and structurally like influenced experience. Like when you really zoom out and you're like, why did I feel that way? It's not like, oh, well, my serotonin was depleted, like the biochemicals were the mechanical thing in your brain wasn't working well. So I thought that was really beautiful, the way that she phrased that and the way that she constantly is talking about it. And you mentioned a few things, like from mutual aid to organizing and everything. And so one sort of official question I was going to ask you, but I can already tell that this question is almost stupid. Are there suicide prevention or intervention methods within Native populations that are methodologically different from non-Native populations, to your knowledge? I mean, you could just answer that, but it seems like it's just, these things just have to be context specific because it's the symptom model doesn't make sense. Right. So
yeah, I think that's true. I think you would see there's quite a range, right? Like there's things that you might more immediately recognize and go, oh, that looks like a mental health practice. And then there are other things that you can look at and you're like, that kind of looks like an indigenous anarchist practice or an indigenous socialist practice. And I think there's also, I mean, I guess there's also like there's also a piece too about, I think that there are, ways that we need to think about clinical and counseling practices within Indigenous communities that draw on knowledge that may or may not feel traditional or kind of contextual. But I think the question of like, what is contextual, I think is ultimately for me about like, what's contextually useful? What do the people that we're serving, what do the communities that we're in solidarity with, what do they say matters? What do they say is useful? Otherwise, I think we fall prey to either extremes of saying like nothing from this bundle of knowledge is useful to this community or not, or we end up kind of producing a very like tokenized or racist representation of what we think mental health in a Native community looks like. I mean, the
right.
endless requests to like throw a medicine wheel onto every evidence-based therapy or give turquoise to Freud is like kind of how I feel a lot of people talk about like projects of indigenizing psychotherapy. But I really do think it looks more creative, it looks more reflective. And
do you get that a lot? Does that actually, do people just sort of go like, oh, let's just sort of make this thing look, let's make this practice aesthetically seem quote unquote indigenous or native? I mean, does that?
For sure.
I guess I haven't.
Absolutely.
Wow. Okay.
And I think the other thing too is like trying to take sort of aspects of Indigenous healing traditions, whether that's like particular ceremonies or linguistic offerings of what, or maybe kind of a cultural practice, and then try to wrap around it some type of empirical study to say that it's actually effective, as if traditions which have survived for millennia need an evidence-based study to demonstrate their value. That's the sort of stuff I think is very prevalent, but yeah.
I mean, I guess existentialism kind of comes to mind to me again, in just that I think like, because they're, again, from like the DBT thing, I'm all about like the diary cards and the skills and the tracking the chain analysis, how scale of 1 to 5, like how strong was your suicidal ideation today and everything. And then like those things, honestly, like I do think those are like very, they can be super successful to just be like, let's just cut the bullshit and like, okay, if you don't want to die and you like recognize that this is like a weird experience and you want to, like, let's, I got some stuff for that, right? Let's do it. But I also have found kind of clinically, just as, this, I'm not referencing research or anything, but that I found that when people really feel like, one, that someone just understands the like wretched despair and hopelessness, and they're not afraid of it, right? Like that it's instead of like, oh, we need to fix that. That's bad that you feel that way. The first, if you're like, yeah, the world's really fucked up. Like that school system here, and it's really fucked up. Like the police situation, that was so fucked up, and the system's really fucked up. Like I've found usually they're like, oh, wow. So you're not just trying to fix me. Like I usually find that's a lot, of a healthy start. And then also if someone's able to develop a sense of like meaning and purpose and to sort of like forge an identity out of the struggle, in the longer term, like what did it mean to have experienced X, Y, and Z? Which, you can talk about interventionist approaches for that, but I mean, I think a lot of the time that doesn't even come from the mental health field. I mean, we can sort of facilitate that process often, but like you're saying, sometimes it's like if someone gets involved in like organizing, if it's like I'd imagine, okay, we're going to block a pipeline together, or we're going to do whatever, right? That it's like, oh my gosh, like now I really am feeling like we're actually doing something to like fight against this messed up system. I mean, I experienced that like in my kind of mid to late 20s. It'd be kind of like, I mean, speaking as a, what do they say? Like not just the president, I'm a client or whatever thing. So anyway, there's just like a random comment on all that. I mean, I'm curious if that resonates at all in terms of that approach of just helping people find that sort of meaning, purpose, what their role is in the world kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, so I guess I would say, I think what you described is like, I could, for the record, I also want to like walk into an airport one day and see the New York Times bestseller of like "fuck up, that's so fucked up" therapy, because that was a good description of what like most of my sessions are like as well. Yeah. I mean, I do think like acknowledging and validating that people's experiences in the world aren't like fucking irrational, and in fact are like real senses of what living in a kind of violent society is like, is a really powerful place to start. I mean, I think it doesn't change the structural fact, but what I think we can do is we can help bolster people's sense of the possibilities of living. And yeah, I think, even in the midst of like profound, like colonial trauma or violence or the kind of decay of empires, I think in the midst of all of that, our communities are still growing and experiencing love and creating. And I think that, part of what the gift of therapy, in the context of my work can look like is about creating a space that helps people not just like ignore the profundity of violence, but also attend to the places of possibility that exist within those spaces. And I think, I think that's not like I always sort of say that we have to sort of stay close to and not pretend like the pain or the trouble isn't there. But that we at the same time have to attend to the things that nourish our capacity to live. And yeah, I mean, there's this really incredible Indigenous feminist writer from the prairies in Saskatchewan named Erica Violet Lee. And she has this article called "In Defense of Wastelands." And she basically talks about like how there are certain places, a lot of the prairies feel like this, where they're kind of disposed of by, the big urban centers, or the places where there's lead poisoning in the water, or there are places where there's sort of extreme examples of poverty. The felt affects of capitalism are very real and close by, but that she reminds us that it's in those spaces that Indigenous people are healing land, who are growing gardens over cement, who are doing these little glimmers, these making real a different type of way of relating with one another, even in the midst of empire. And I think that is like, that's a really powerful image for me of what therapy can be. That it at its best, maybe it can have that effect of making possible some living in the midst of what are otherwise very difficult days.
Wow, that's maybe after I want to put that in the show notes so people can. I want to read that article. That sounds really good.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'm also curious. This is another one of the questions that we'd sent you, but it has to do with that. Like, and I don't know if in Canada this is even accurate, but in the U.S., the sort of native to like white men suicide rates of, unless something around this has changed. I know this is like there's a statistics you'll see, or I had seen a lot, like whether it was in grad school or other places, and I'd seen different kind of theories around it. I mean, I think or I guess just for listeners, if anyone's not aware, the rates of suicide amongst Native people in what we call the U.S. And of like white males tend to be like pretty similar. I think depending on which study, some will say that like one of those groups is higher, but I think it depends on the studies. But I'm also not like an expert on it. But I remember when I saw that, I thought like, I think a lot of people will think, well, wait a minute, well, white men have it all and all that, right? So like that's really weird. And natives, like you'd think, well, obviously natives would. There's been such historical disenfranchisement, of course, right? So, but then sometimes there'll be like a weird sort of like, well, that's right, because white men actually have it the worst, like those weird conversations. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I have my own kind of theories on it, but I'm curious if you've given this any thought or have theories or research on this kind of seemingly bizarre phenomenon, and maybe it's not bizarre at all. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it is a interesting parallel that's being drawn. I think, the truth is that if you look anywhere in the world where there is profound forms of social inequality, and that could be on the basis of economics or political power or gender or sexuality or migration status or legal status, you sort of name it, wherever you find substantial social inequity and perceived or real differences in power to do something about that inequity, you'll find high rates of suicide. It's why in highly industrialized, mega capitalist countries, suicide is on the rise among economically what would have been kind of the former middle class, in part because there's greater and greater debt and wealth disparity among that population. It's why older adults, regardless of race, are increasingly at a higher rate of death by suicide. It's why farmers in India who are being disenfranchised by a series of public policies that are fueled by a type of neoliberal capitalism and globalization of particular agricultural industry are increasingly at risk for suicide. There are so many different contexts, and I think what the question highlights for me is that in the United States, as well as in places like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and elsewhere in the world, Ireland and the UK, where race and racial differences are sort of that Indigenous people and white folks and Indigenous people and white men are pitched as sort of being so incommensurably different on the basis of their social power. But the truth is, when you kind of begin to look specifically, within communities with a greater degree of context and a greater degree of specificity, there are unique histories of struggle or of experiences of violence that are maybe not as apparent on the surface of that one way of coding difference. And those differences are like racial conflict and racial differences very well. The social power of racialization is very real in terms of the ways in which Indigenous young people, for example, are likely to experience violence at the hands of white male police officers, for example. But that doesn't mean that our ability to understand one another's grief is somehow incommensurable. I think that requires a type of willingness to learn about each other first and foremost.
Yeah, no, I like that answer. I think what stands out there is this because the dichotomy, even the way that I kind of framed it, but I guess it was more as like a hypothetical of like, you'd think like, oh, these two groups are opposites or something, like as if there's like some spectrum of, or there's some absolute hierarchy or something around this, rather than like looking at all the the complexities of, because I think if you really just kind of look at things from a historical and structural lens, you'll start to see the complexities come through more accurately and more clearly. Like even like just the construction of whiteness, to my understanding, right? Like in the U.S., it's like whiteness. I mean, I think there are debates on this, but from what I've seen, like whiteness was like codified as a thing from like the West Virginia plantation world, like in a very official legal way, where it's like it was almost created as like a sort of middle management position, like whiteness as we kind of understand it, right? And something Harriet said in one of our last episodes was that, because I'd never actually heard it framed this way, but a lot of people who before they were considered white, but a lot of people from Europe were actually brought over to populate colonies, not as like, yay, yippee, we're so excited about this, but people who are either criminals or indentured servants, or there's all these complexities there, just like, hey, let's get some women over here so we can populate the colonies. And it wasn't like, hey, let's get some privileged white women to have some privilege and have some nice stuff or something. It wasn't like, hey, white people are the aristocracy and we're just going to keep doing our aristocratic thing, and everybody else who's not white is going to get screwed over. Like there were like a lot of complexities, which I think definitely in some of the more mainstream, I think, identity conversations totally gets lost, which isn't to say, because you could also go a weird direction, I guess, and say like, yeah, look at how hard white people had it. But it's more that like, well, what does that even mean? I mean, I don't know. Like whiteness in of itself is like a pretty complicated category that requires like some nuanced analysis. So yeah.
And I think it's hard to capture the full, like, I think history of racism for the entire continent in probably a few sentences. But I mean, I think to the question, I think what really matters to me is the idea that there are ways of understanding suicide in a particular context that when you group people by any sort of particular category, you can observe differences. But I'll say, like, within Indigenous communities, we also see differences too, like the impact of trans misogyny and homophobia, differentially impacts queer and trans and Two-Spirit Indigenous young people within our communities, people with disabilities. And so the sort of like, I think, value of intersectional analyses of mental health is not just to sort of like make us all really skillful about talking about aspects of our identity, but it's ultimately to help us better understand how members of our communities are differentially impacted and cumulatively impacted by intersecting forms of structural violence. And I think that to me is something just we have to keep like at the center, because I can oppose the same. I guess I can see a link between the same type of exploitative economic policies that impact rural middle-aged white men and the types of economic apartheid that impact Indigenous communities. Those aren't fully incomprehensible to each other. I think they can actually help us understand what life under capitalism feels like.
Totally. I also think that like privilege comes with it a certain psychological damage sometimes. Like if you being better off requires for someone to be worse off, like you're bound to at some point have to face that, right? Like either there has to be cognitive dissonance or denial or minimization or dehumanization of whoever's being fucked over for you to have a decent situation. Like I almost feel like, psychically you can only sort of deny reality for so long. So that's like one of my many theories is I think like the narrative, I guess the sort of reality and the narrative of like, white male is the default thing. Like as that's been increasingly challenged and economically, because there's just so many more like economically mobile white men in say the US that, so anyway, yeah, I think it's a super complicated thing. But in any case,
there's an element of just fighting over scraps as well. Like obviously the history of all of this stuff is important, but you suddenly realize at a certain point, if the system's sick, it's no surprise that individuals get sick. But also, like, if the system is designed for exploitation, then ultimately you will end up just fighting over whatever piece of the pie you can get. It's and I think, I guess the thing that sort of really struck me, particularly towards the end of your book, was talking about that the healing of Indigenous youth is caught up in the healing of the settlers and the colonial powers, and it's just like, holy shit, there's, sorry to swear, but there's a lot of there's a lot of legitimate anger and resentment towards the oppressor, like whatever situation you find yourself in, but realizing that the path to that also includes some element of reaching out. It's like that's a huge task, right? That is, what does that even look like?
I mean, I think psychotherapy as a practice, at least how it's evolved in North America and Europe, has pretty much been very woefully unprepared for that level of work. Because I think what that is talking about is it's talking about a different type of justice. It's not just talking about my healing or my journey. It's talking about our collective healing. And I think, in some ways, like, restorative justice as a practice is a place of possibility, a way of thinking about what might be possible if communities held space for that fuller circle of accountability and responsibility taking. I also think, one thing that's probably shifted from my tone in my tone since writing that book is that while I think there is this sort of hope that's there for the possibility of being in a different type of relationship across differences of power and histories of violation. I also think that the power of people, and particularly the power of oppressed people, to change their world should never be underestimated. And I think that there's a lot of power in our communities to heal, and that healing can take the form of trying to help every system reform, or it can also take the form of us just building the type of futures that we need right now, building the type of networks of care I think I alluded to before, creating and experimenting with different practices of mutual aid and restoration, and not necessarily always needing the governmentality of public systems or infrastructure to do that on our behalf, but to build that for ourselves, I think is something that I think, like, as mental health professionals, we could get really committed to. And I also think one other step of that I would take is to say that, those of us who provide services under mandates of law or under regulated professionals, I think we could take more principled stances that align our interests with that of movements and communities, as opposed to the interests of policing and governments. I think about this in places like harm reduction work, or in places like suicide prevention work, or in peer support, that there's so many, I think those sort of moments of restoration and creativity come when we align ourselves ethically and politically with the interests of communities that struggle and that are suffering under oppression, than by trying to bolster capital by, being increasingly recognized and funded by and made extensions of governments. So I'm probably giving away way too much of my political leanings in this, but that's.
I mean, we've thrown. Carrie and I have, Marxist, socialist, communist. It's come on, it's fine. We're like,
well, again, I guess the thing that I was reminded of whilst reading the book, obviously, it's the need for self-determination, and I was reminded of some other thing I'd read in a book about the anarchist banker, that the anarchist realizes money is the thing that runs everything. So they become a banker to get rich so that then no one can tell them what to do, right? So, and then, I mean, I could be, terribly sort of ignorant here, but what happens in terms of, certainly I've seen or read some stuff about what happens in the US with native land and casinos, and I was just like, well, hang on, that must be a brilliant way to take money from a bunch of people who've got money to just burn and then reuse that resource for your own ends. Does that form any part of self-determination, or is that
I mean, I think we could. I mean, honestly, I think you're asking the right question in the sense of pointing to a theory of change to enact material justice, which I guess is to say that, like, the land on which Canada is built on top of is and remains Indigenous people's land, and one of the ways that you can produce immediate shifts in the sort of livability of a place is to return land, because not so that Indigenous people can build our own capitalist societies. I don't think that's what I'm meaning, but in the sense of being committed to altering the material well-being of Indigenous communities is one way to immediately change what's possible. And so, I mean, I think when we look today, in the midst of, our prime minister, is at COP talking about, how Canada's a climate leader, and yet Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is a climate clown. He's buying pipelines that extend over unceded territory of Indigenous people. And on that literal territory are traditional healing centers run by a group of Indigenous psychologists that work with Indigenous people to revitalize relationships to land and language. And so, I mean, I think what would a move towards health equity look like? Well, we should equalize funding. Yes, we should make reforms to health services, but also we should stop robbing Indigenous people of their land and burning up the planet in the process. I mean, I think those things will go a long way. And also the material wealth that has produced the type of social inequalities in North America is not built out of nothing. It's built off of chattel slavery and settler colonialism. And so, I mean, I think reparative work is needed to address that economic history, but it's not something that will be in a single moment, settled in a single time. It will be reconstituted and necessarily restored multiple times over many generations, because its impacts are multi-generational.
Well, we're approaching the hour, and I had like one other official. I feel like we kind of got to it. It was like why we medicalize and separate out "quote unquote" mental health interventions. I feel like we've kind of we've weaved in and out of that overall.
I definitely have a small question, which is that you mentioned the process of smudging whilst in like a confined, I don't know if it was a prison or it was youth detention center or whatever. I was sort of fascinated by how other people must react to that. because you're sort of making the point, right? Like, this is us, we're here, and this is a way we can sort of subvert you sort of locking us up. And I thought, wow, okay, how are people reacting to that, and what does it do?
Yeah, I mean, I think the political power of any act is subject to commodification and instrumentalization always, right? So, today, I live in a city where the Toronto police force, which disproportionately assaults Black and Indigenous people, will release promo videos trying to hire Indigenous and Black police officers, and in those videos you'll see police officers smudging, which to me I think is just like hilariously awkward, because cops are like handling sacred medicines, and cops who are doing the very violence and perpetrating the type of assault against our communities are using something that has the political significance when a young person in the context of a racist correctional system does it as something very different. Like when a young person whose sort of history has been disrupted by and cultural connection is disrupted by very intentional policies of colonization that separate them from language, family, custom, develops the individual or collective agency to pick those things up again, to connect to their language, to connect to their ceremonies and traditions. It's not just, that they're getting cultural. It's that they're beginning to recognize their agency and relationship to these structures. And I think it can be, to the racists in our system, it's offensive. And, you only have to look for evidence of white people shooting Native people at the site of Native people in our day-to-day lives in Canada to know that there is real racism. But I think by and large, it's more often just treated in a very depoliticized way by folks who want to sort of relegate the self-determinism of Indigenous people to that's a nice sort of cultural thing. The most important study in Canada today on the prevention of Indigenous suicide says that one of the most protective factors against suicide is cultural continuity. And so when people read that, they think, oh, well, that means like we're learning how to say hello in our language, we're learning how to craft, we're learning how to maybe do a ceremony. But if you actually look at what the structural factors are for cultural continuity, it's things like having decentralized community-led policing. It's things like having control and budgeting control over reserve school systems and social services. They're much more concrete material things. And so I guess when police or when correctional officers, experience young people taking up their culture, I think those are sort of the two realms in which they see it. They either see it as very depoliticized, or they just see a Native person and respond with racism. But I care less about what happens to them and more about what's happening in the hearts and minds and bodies of those young people, that they're becoming more connected to who they are and are imagining a future where they are not only free but powerful enough to resist the violence of our state.
Yeah, and presumably, if you for these young people who are in these places, or that there is this sort of suicidal ideation, that when you offer up historical sort of important cultural practices, that becomes a way of finding some sort of identity beyond the one that says you're a prisoner or a bad person or not worth anything.
Yeah, I think that identity piece is maybe like one of the first pathways to a different future.
Mm.
But not just because identity is a sort of neutral category, but because identity, I think, is sort of at the core a way of connecting to community. Identity is in a sense a way of understanding your responsibilities in the world, that your life can have a purpose beyond that particular moment and juncture in relationship to other people, and other places. So yeah, I think it is really powerful. It is really powerful for people, and also to remember too that something, in that example, it's like smudging as a ceremony, that within my own lifetime, some of those practices were still criminalized in this country. So it's important to have that sort of, like, in my mother's generation or my grandmother's generation, that you couldn't you couldn't like actually physically have freedom of mobility from the reserve without the accompanying of a police officer out of the government sphere, that you would try to stage an insurrection. These are the sort of like very hidden outside of the scope of sort of the general public's knowledge of our history, but it's wild stuff.
Yeah, I think there's just that quote. I think I had it as a question, but I think it's just a question that you wrote in the book, which is, why is a free Indigenous young person such a threat to the colonial status quo? And I think the example you just gave, it didn't necessarily have to be a young person. It could just be anyone. Mm-hmm. Presents a threat. It's kind of fascinating. It's not a question. It's just a statement.
Hey man, we're just talking. We're just doing a podcast.
I love the question. Thank you for reading the book too. That's so you write something sometimes, and that book I wrote many years ago now, and when you write something, you never know how it's going to enter the world, and it's always a gift to hear how it comes back to you.
Yeah, no, it was great, and I was a good boy. I bought it from the publisher's website as well. So,
oh wow,
yeah,
well, they're a pretty rad group. They publish some really interesting critical perspectives in social sciences. So yeah, I'm really lucky to work with Fernwood.
No, it's great.
I would be fine to like extend it further, but I had a thing scheduled at 11, not like a thing I had to be out like at the hour, but so I was going to say, Dr. Ansloos, if you had maybe things, whether it's like your book, websites, groups you're involved in, things you wanted to maybe plug, and then also, an email, you could send me the link so I could put in the show notes. But just for any listeners who've kind of been engaged with the discussion with you today, they would want to learn more about your perspective and, things you're involved in.
Sure, absolutely. I'll send you some links to put into the show notes, but certainly, connecting, for those of you who are interested in sort of more critical perspectives on suicide, getting connected to the critical suicidology, critical suicide studies network is a great way to do that. I also think, there's just tremendous, we're living in kind of a golden age of Indigenous arts and literature. So there's just so many amazing Indigenous writers to be reading and learning from. And I'll maybe give you my top 5 favorites at the moment. And, okay. And yeah, I'm definitely always open to share any of my papers or books. And I have a book coming out in about 18 months, focused very in depth at the topic of our conversation today on Indigenous people and suicide. So I'll look forward to sharing that in the future. But yeah, that's basically it.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Ansloos. Okay, and we'll put stuff, so anyone that's listening, just look in the show notes and there'll be some links there when you listen. And then also, we just always say this at the end, if you want to contact us to respond to anything we talked about here, just email us at itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. If there are comments you want to directed to Dr. Ansloos, we can also just pass that his way. And if you want to become a supporter of the podcast, Patreon, get early access to stuff. We have our little Discord chat room thingy, and monthly reading groups, although we totally failed actually last month or this month or whatever to do that. Sorry, I've been busy. Patreon.com/itsnotjustinyourhead. And I think that's it. And yeah, this was really great, Dr. Ansloos. Thank you so much for joining the pod and Liam, that was awesome that you chimed in and you read Dr. Ansloos's like whole book. That's like more than I feel like embarrassed because like I wish I could actually read everyone's books that like come on to our show, but like I just like actually don't have the time and it would be like expensive.
Exactly. Yeah, I had the time, so it's fine.
But it's always like embarrassing. It's like, hey, let's talk about your ideas that I haven't like fully consumed. It's like embarrassing. But so Liam to the rescue for that. And yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ansloos. And
thank you. Thank you both.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.